Good evening. Welcome back to The Bible Speaks Today from the new studio at LBC Television Ministries. I say new because, as I said last week, I've been moved into the Sunshine Club studio, which has this wonderful backdrop behind me and this sort of thing. And we've done some other changes to move the camera positions around, things like that. And after the recording the first program, so just to remind you, those of you who don't watch on a regular basis, we record two of these programs each recording session back to back, which is why I'm always wearing the same shirt a week later for you. And I wondered if they told me in the last program that I spent too much time looking at the monitor, which is behind the cameras here. So they just came and turned it off, so I can't watch it. Sad. Anyway, I said we did a pretty good job. The set looks great. I said, but I do have one bone to pick. And they said, what's that? I said, well, you didn't put my coffee cup out there. You know, I've had this coffee cup for, well, those of you who've been watching the program for a long time, and it's always there and it's always got coffee in it. And this time I found you might have seen it last week, a styrofoam cup, not kosher. Anyway, so I got my coffee, so all's right with the world. So, as I said, we're making some changes here at LBC, and this is one of them, and there's some other things happening, and we're going to be upgrading, and we already film, for those of you who like the technicalities, we already film in HD. Unfortunately, the Community Production Center, which relays our stuff to the cable companies, you know. By the way, those of you who have Cincinnati Bell, you know you can get us on 817. You did know that, did you? Good. You're probably watching it on 817, right? The rest of you, it's 17 on the cable channels. But we're not in HD yet, although the pictures are much better than they used to be. Anyway, regard that. 3D we're not to do, HD we can do. We're still talking about Jerusalem. And I finished up last week with remarking how, you know, all these different centuries, all these different things, at some periods of time, Jerusalem fell into the hands of 4 different people in 4 different years. It must be really difficult when you live there, wondering who's in charge, you know. A bit like government sometimes, you know. Well, not this one, but some of them. Okay, so, and I'm finished up by saying the Mongols, we're in 1260 odd now, the Mongols started raiding into Palestine. And that's a long way to come from the steppes of Central Asia into Palestine. These people were coming a long way. But it's not so very clear whether they actually got to Jerusalem, you know, because it wasn't considered that important, you know, as far as, oh, it's a big city, riches, let's go and invade it. But apparently there's a report there of some of the Jews that were in Jerusalem fled out to neighboring villages. There's a few scattering accounts of those. I've been trying to nail those down from where I saw them and haven't found them yet. But anyway, in 1267, so we're creeping on a bit, a gentleman called Nahmanides from Catalonia, a Jewish man from Catalonia in Spain, traveled to Jerusalem, and what he did in the old city was establish the Ramban Synagogue, the second oldest active synagogue in Jerusalem, which was, if you remember, the big one before that was the Karaite Jews who built that about 300 years earlier, in the middle of the 13th century. So, in the middle of the 13th century, I'm reading on my notes too fast, Jerusalem once again fell under the control of the Egyptians, okay, the Mamluk Sultanate, they call it, right? And it stayed that way for hundreds of years. So now so all this time, right up until, 13th century, which is not close to us, but at least it's sort of a recognizable period to some of us. Up until then, from 1099 to way up in the 13th century, Jerusalem had been backwards and forwards, fought over, argued over, demolished, rebuilt. A really turbulent period of time. So, in what I call the early modern period, modern being relative speaking, of course, in about 1200 and something, 1200 and, I don't know, not quite sure when, there was a monastery a Franciscan monastery founded by the brother of Francis of Assisi. Now, those of you may know who he is. Brother Elia from Assisi in 1299 founded this monastery, and the idea of it was to preach the gospel to the Muslims. So it was an evangelistic idea, if you like, and this building of this resulted in by the time a meeting with the Sultan of Egypt, who was Malik al-Kalim at the time, who was surprised by the fact that a Christian brother, a Christian monk, would even want to talk to him. So it gives you an idea of the divisions. Anyway, but he allowed him to carry on with his missionary work, which is pretty tolerant for the period. And eventually the Franciscan province, or the diocese, or whatever you want to call it, extended to Cyprus, to Syria, to Lebanon, and the Holy Land. And eventually they moved into Acre in 1291. So basically all the major countries of the Middle East had a Franciscan presence there, big Christian presence. Okay, they were in Acre and Sidon, in Antioch, Tripoli, Jaffa, Jerusalem, and from Cyprus, where they had gone after all the persecutions during the different conquests and things like that. They'd started planning relationship, going back to Jerusalem. Nobody ever forgot about Jerusalem. It was still the Christian place, as it is still the Muslim place and the Jewish place as well. So they started making this big effort to convert the Muslim thing, given that they had good relations, absolutely good relations with the Egyptian rulers, the Sultanate of Egypt, as it was then. Now, this is a big thing. I mean, this wasn't done by conquest. This wasn't done by storming the ramparts and taking it over and being I'm in charge, get out type thing. This was a evangelistic conversion program, much to be admired, I suppose. In about 1333, there was a French chap who was a monk. He bought the cenacle, and it's called the cenacle, Cenacle, which is supposed to be the room where the Last Supper took place on Mount Zion. Now, all I know about the Last Supper is what I read in the Bible, and that they sent a man ahead and said, "There's a room prepared for us. Go find it, and we'll celebrate it there." It doesn't say where it is. And there is a tradition, of course, that Mark, the writer of the Gospel, Mark, was the young man who went in, and it was a relation of his that had the room. I don't know, but it's interesting. But anyway, at this time in 1300 something, they figured they got the room where the Last Supper had taken place. Okay, and anyway, this French chap bought it and some land to build a monastery nearby for the Franciscan monks, and he used funds provided by the King and Queen of Naples. Okay, now that's unusual in its start to get money like that, but anyway, the King and Queen of Naples, Italy, provided the money for this Franciscan monastery, and then Pope Clement the sixth, wrote what they call a papal bull. That's basically a Pope's letter, if you will. I'm not that familiar with it, but it wrote a paper which granted and approved this new monastery. I guess in those days the Pope had to approve any new monasteries, and what that became known as is the Franciscan custody of the Holy Land. Okay, so the friars coming from any one of the different provinces, under the jurisdiction of a superior, of course, of the monastery on Mount Zion were a big presence in Jerusalem, in the Cenacle, in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and in the Basilica of the Nativity at Bethlehem. And their job, their principal activity, was to ensure that the church life, the liturgical life of Christian message in these sanctuaries carried on going, and also to give spiritual assistance to pilgrims coming from the West. What's interesting about this is that despite Jerusalem changing hands and being governed by this country and that ruler, people still came from all over Europe to visit Jerusalem. It was considered the thing to do. Okay? So, the Franciscans provided places for them to stay, medical assistance, food and lodgings for the people and that sort of thing. And also, of course, to the European merchants and people who lived there or were passing through to go to Egypt and Syria and to Lebanon. Because even at that point in time, Jerusalem hadn't changed from being in the center point of the trade routes going up and down the country. Remember, in Solomon's time, the big thing about Jerusalem is you wanted to go north to south, south to north, you had to go through Jerusalem. And so that's what the Franciscans were doing, providing, much like the Templars and the Hospitallers did in times gone by, providing assistance, encouragement, and this sort of thing. And what came with that, of course, was a direct relationship with the Eastern Christianity churches, what we now call the Greek and Russian Orthodox churches. Okay, so again, Jerusalem became the center point of all this. You have great gobs of Christianity. It's not the right word, perhaps, but great masses of people from Europe and that sort of thing coming to Jerusalem on pilgrimage. At the same time, you had people from the eastern side coming. I mean, even though they'd split with the Christian point, they become a sort of different sect, Jerusalem was still important to them. Okay? I mean, there's an account of the monastery on Mount Zion being used by a gentleman called Alberto di Sartino when he came on behalf of the Pope he had a mission to get the Oriental Christians, which would be the Greeks and the Coptics and the Ethiopians, with Rome in what we have on record today as the Council of Florence in 1440. So in Jerusalem was considered, if you like, neutral territory, if that's the right word to use, but here's the Orthodox, the Greek and Roman and Russian Orthodox, Coptic Orthodox Church, and the Christian Church, right? And don't forget, these people over here, the Orthodox people didn't recognize the Pope so much, but meeting together, maybe trying to iron out their differences or at least agree to discuss. And the same reason, in another 40-odd years later, Giovanni de Calabria stopped in Jerusalem on his way to meet the Christian Negus, like the Pope of Ethiopia. Okay? So Jerusalem is still the focal point of all of this. In 1482, the same year, in fact, a visiting priest, Dominican in this case, Felix Fabry, described Jerusalem as, and I quote, a dwelling place of diverse nations of the world. And then he goes on to say, now get this, you can tell how stiff-necked some of these people were, and it says, was a collection of all manner of abominations. And what he listed as abominations were Saracens are Arabs, okay, Greeks, Syrians, Jacobites, Abyssinians, and Nestorians, now, Armenians, Gregorians, Maronites, Turkomans, and Bedouins, and assassins. Assassins were, at one time, this period of time, a sect. You wouldn't need to read up about them. Maybe we'll do a program about them once, I don't know. There was a possible Druze sect, again, one of these offshoot religions, and some Mamluks. And the Christians and the Jews who lived in Jerusalem lived in great poverty and in conditions of great deprivation, it says. So, whilst it seems that people are still coming to Jerusalem to visit and acknowledge the holy places, and all these different religious bodies of different Christian or quasi-Christian bodies are meeting or using it as a sort of stopping off place to go to their meetings, there weren't many, the people who lived there, the Christians who lived there and the Jews weren't doing very well. This chap visiting said that there's not many Christians there, but there are a great many Jews, and these the Muslims persecute in various ways. Now, I don't have any references to that. I've got to assume that Jews and Christians were considered second-class citizens by the Muslims, who after all ruled the country, and it was their city. So, maybe the sort of things we read about in the history books took place. I don't know. But what this chap goes on to say is that he wishes the Christians, the Latin Christians, I suppose he means the ones who observe the Pope in Rome as their head, long for all their hearts for Christian princes to come and conquer the country and put it back under the Church of Rome. Okay? Well, that didn't happen. What did happen was that in 5051, the Turks, who were by then controlling the country, okay, Turks taken over from the Egyptians, kicked out the friars from their monastery and all the places, okay? Kicked them all out from the room where the Last Supper was held and all that. Kicked them all out, but gave them permission to purchase a Gregorian monastery. So that's an Orthodox monastery of nuns, would you believe? So they kicked the nuns out, and the Franciscans were able to purchase a monastery, or turn it into a monastery, in the northwest quarter of the city, which became the new centre for Christian development in Jerusalem, and in fact developed into the Latin convent of Saint Saviour, which is still there today. Okay? So, 1555. It's kind of annoying, and let me backtrack a bit. I should say that in 1517 was when the Turks took over, obviously a little earlier. It was taken over by the Ottoman Empire, but it did enjoy a bit of a period of renewal and some peace prior to this under Suleiman the Magnificent. He's a well-known historical figure, and he built big walls, new walls in what is now called the Old City of Jerusalem, and some of the foundations in that still remain. And there actually was a little bit of peace, because I guess they decided that trying to be difficult with everything wasn't worth it. But anyway, this chap, Jews and Muslims were allowed a freedom of religion. However, they were still kind of second-class citizens. They might have been able to worship, but they were still sort of subject to the whims and pressures of the Muslim thing. Okay, but it is said that at that period of time you could find a synagogue and a church and a mosque in the same street, and that's pretty unusual for any period of history. Anyway, it remained open. The point I'm trying to make is it remained open to all religions, although the management of the country under Suleiman, it stagnated and became, there was no growth, so it was kind of almost like a backwater. Okay, in 1700, now we're coming into quite modern times. A chap called Judah Hahassid led the largest group of Jewish immigrants into the land of Israel in centuries. In other words, thousands of them moved in Jerusalem, and they built the Herva synagogue. Now, bear in mind that this happened again after the Second World War, if you remember. But anyway, for now. But that Hurva synagogue from 1700 served as the main synagogue in Jerusalem from what, 15th, 16th century until 1948. What happened in 1948? Well, it was destroyed by the Arab Legion. We'll come to that later. But it was actually rebuilt, would you believe, in 2010. We're going ahead of ourselves, but it actually was. But between 1703 and 1705, hard to be definitive about the dates, even though that's a relatively modern period in history, Jerusalem's Muslim leadership, now Muslim leadership, not Christian, and the majority of its inhabitants, so that meant Christian, Jews and Muslims alike, revolted against the Ottoman governor of the district, a chap called, Mehmed Pasha Kurd Bayram, okay? In what is known in Palestinian history, or history all told, is the Naqib al-Ashraf revolt. And during the course of the revolt, this is what's interesting, during the course of the revolt, Jerusalem's residents basically managed their own business, collected their own taxes, did their own repairs, ran their own waterworks, did all their own policing, and basically self-rule until the Ottoman authorities restored control of their city some years later. So that's a whole congregation of Arabs and Jews and Muslims living and administrating the city all on their own without any outside interference. In the middle of the 19th century, and we're jumping a little bit here because nothing much changed once the Ottomans took over again, it basically stayed the same. But in the middle of the 19th century, with the decline of the Ottoman Empire, now if you're a student of Middle Eastern history, you'll know what I'm talking about, but the Ottoman Empire basically got so over-bloated it fell in on itself, like so many empires did. But in the mid-19th century, with the decline of the Ottoman Empire, the city, Jerusalem, was once again a backwater. Now how Jerusalem, the shining star on the hill, blah, 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 can ever become a backwater is amazing, but it didn't have more than 8,000 people at that period of time. That's not a great deal of people. But even then, it was extremely mixed up. The word I guess I wrote down here, I didn't want to use, but I will, is heterogeneous. It was just, everybody was there. Because, of course, it's significant to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I mean, 8,000 people were divided into four major communities: Jewish, Christian, Muslim, and Armenian. Armenian, I think, tends to be the Orthodox side of things, right? And of course, once again, the first three of those, the Jewish and the Christian and the Muslim, could be divided again into subgroups, because there's this brand of Judaism and then that brand of Judaism. And then we've got Christian groups all over the place in this period of time with different beliefs. And they're based on their precise religious affiliation, probably based on their country of origin, perhaps. This is what I found interesting. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Okay, we know where that is. We've seen pictures of it. It's still there today. We know what it is. Was meticulously partitioned between the Greek Orthodox, Catholic, Armenian, Coptic, and Ethiopian churches. Partitioned. And each one used it at different times. And the tensions between, this is what gets me. So remember what I said, Catholic, Armenian, Coptic, and Ethiopian, all Christian denominations, right? The tensions between the groups ran so deep and were so in your face things, the keys to the shrine and the doors were safeguarded, get this, by a pair of neutral Muslim families. So there is the Muslims holding the keys and partitioning them out to whichever group. It's Tuesday, it must be the Catholics, that sort of thing. It's crazy. And of course, at that time, the communities in Jerusalem were located mainly around their primary shrines. I mean, the Muslim community surrounded the Haram al-Sharif, which is the Temple Mount, of course, in the northeast. The Christians lived mainly in the vicinity of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is northwest. Let's see, the Jews lived on the slope of the Western Wall, which is southeast, and the Armenians lived near the Zion Gate, which is southwest. But this wasn't exclusive. I mean, there were overlaps. You know, it wasn't like this side of the street's Armenian and that side of the street's Catholic. It was, roughly. Unfortunately, what it did was form the basis of the four quarters of Jerusalem when it was divided into four quarters by the British Mandate in 1917, just towards the end of the Second World War. The British said, we're going to change the way this is done. We're going to stop people arguing with each other. We're going to divide the city up into four quarters. And they based their four quarters on the areas I've just shown you. But as I already said, it wasn't exclusive. So no doubt some people got deposed. But it formed the basis of the four quarters of the city, which lasted from 17 till 1948. And on that point, we're going to have to leave you. There are a lot more changes coming, and you're probably not so much aware of these as you were of the older ones. So stay with me. Next week, we'll continue this. Don't forget to read your Bible. Good night. God bless.